My name is Sarah Coleman. I'm 31, and 4 months ago I owned a small farm-to-table restaurant in the Pearl District in Portland called Wildflower. 2 locations, 23 employees. A James Beard semi-finalist nomination tucked into a frame above the host stand that my daughter liked to point at when we walked in. I wasn't rich. I was the kind of comfortable where I could buy organic strawberries without checking the price and put $600 into my daughter's college fund every month and still have enough to take her to the coast on a long weekend if I wanted to. That was the life I had built. That was the life my stepfather took apart in 11 weeks. The night my mother told me I was no longer welcome in the family home, I was sitting in the driver's seat of a Subaru Outback that wasn't even fully paid off in the parking lot of a Fred Meyer on Northeast Halsey, with my 6-year-old daughter Posey curled up in the back under my winter coat. It was December 19th, 6 days before Christmas. The dashboard said it was 34 degrees outside and Posey had a fever of 103.2, and I knew that number because I had taken her temperature with the little drugstore thermometer 4 times in the last hour, like checking would change it. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was my mother. The text was 3 sentences long. She said that after everything I'd put the family through, she and Roger had decided it was best if I didn't come around anymore. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped I would find peace. Then a separate text, 2 minutes later, asking me to please not contact my younger half-sister either, because Caroline was finally doing well and didn't need the stress. I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the seat because if I kept looking at it, I was going to do something stupid like reply. And there was nothing left to say to a woman who had just chosen the man she married after my real father died over the daughter she'd raised alone for 9 years before he showed up. Posey made a small wet sound in the back seat, the kind of cough that's been living too low in a child's chest for too long. I reached back and put my hand on her forehead, and her skin was so hot it didn't even feel like skin anymore. It felt like one of those flannel rice bags you microwave for a sore neck. I had $31 in my checking account. I had a credit card that had been declined twice already that week at the gas station. I had a daughter who'd been coughing since Thanksgiving, and a restaurant that wasn't mine anymore, and a mother who'd just told me I was disposable, and outside the Subaru, it was starting to sleet. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because I have a feeling this story is going to find people in a lot of different kitchens and a lot of different cars, and I want to know where you are when you hear it. So, 11 weeks. That's how long it took. It started in October, the day my mother called and said Roger wanted to invest in Wildflower. He'd just sold his auto parts distribution company in Vancouver, Washington, for what she called a real number, and he wanted to put some of it somewhere meaningful. And didn't I always say I wanted to open a 3rd location down in Eugene? I should have said no right then. I should have remembered the way Roger looked at me when I was 15 and told me my grief over my dad was getting performative. I should have remembered every Christmas where he gave Caroline a real present and gave me a gift card to somewhere I'd never shopped. But my mother was crying a little on the phone, the soft kind of crying she uses like a tool, and she said this was Roger trying to be a real father to me finally, and could I just let him in? I let him in. He brought a lawyer named Doug Hennessy to the first meeting. Doug had silver hair and one of those handshakes that wants you to know something. The paperwork they put in front of me was thick. I should have taken it to my own attorney. I had an attorney, a woman named Priya in the Lloyd district, who'd handled my lease negotiations, and she would have caught it in 20 minutes. But Roger said it was just standard small business investor language, and my mother said, why are we paying 2 lawyers when Doug is family now? And I was tired, and I signed. The clause was on page 19. It gave Roger's holding company a 38% stake in Wildflower LLC, plus operational oversight authority in the event of, and I'm going to remember this phrase for the rest of my life, material financial distress as determined by majority capital holders. Roger was the majority capital holder. Roger got to decide when I was distressed. By the 2nd week of November, he'd decided. It happened fast, the way these things do when somebody is moving the pieces and you can't see the board. Our pork supplier, a small operation in Yamhill County I'd worked with for 4 years, suddenly couldn't deliver. Our point-of-sale system went down on a Saturday night during 120 cover service, and nobody at the company would return my calls for 3 days. A reviewer from one of the local food blogs wrote a piece about Wildflower being in turmoil that nobody had asked her to write. Then the health department showed up for a surprise inspection and wrote us up for 3 violations in the downstairs prep kitchen that I'd had inspected and signed off on 6 weeks earlier. I was on the phone every day, 16 hours a day, putting out fires. I lost 12 pounds. I stopped sleeping. Posey's kindergarten teacher pulled me aside one morning and asked if everything was okay at home because Posey had started chewing her shirt collar again, which she only did when she was scared. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Doug Hennessy emailed me a notice of operational takeover under the distress clause. The board, which was Roger and Doug, and a man I'd never met, named Curtis Ackerman, had voted to remove me from day-to-day operations of my own restaurant pending a, quote, stabilization review. I was given 30 minutes to clear out my office. My head chef, Marisol, who I'd hired 3 years before when she was a line cook at a hotel restaurant downtown, and who I considered my closest friend, watched me carry a box of my own knives out the back door past the dumpsters and didn't say a word. I went to my mother's house that night. I drove the whole way thinking about what I would say. I had a whole speech. I was going to be calm. I was going to be the daughter she'd raised, the one who used the right fork. She made me wait in the front hall for almost 10 minutes while she finished a phone call. When she came out, she was wearing the silk blouse she wears to her book club. She didn't hug me. She gestured at the living room like I was a contractor she'd called for an estimate. I told her what Roger had done. I told her about the clause, the suppliers, the inspection, the locked-out office. I told her my daughter was sleeping badly and chewing her shirts, and that I was 3 weeks from not being able to make rent. My mother listened with her hands folded in her lap. When I was done, she said, very gently, that I had always been a dramatic girl, that Roger had been more than generous, that I needed to stop seeing conspiracies everywhere and consider whether maybe I just wasn't cut out for the business after all. She said Caroline had told her I'd been calling and texting too much lately, and it was upsetting Caroline's recovery. Caroline was 26 and had been in and out of treatment for an opioid problem since she was 19, and I had been the one driving her to her intake appointment in Gresham 2 years before. But apparently now I was the one upsetting her. I asked my mother, and I will never forget the exact way I phrased it. I asked her if she actually believed any of what she was saying, or if she was just choosing to. She stood up. She told me she thought it was best if I went home. I drove home and cried in the bathroom with the fan on so Posey wouldn't hear me. That was Thanksgiving weekend. By December 10th, I'd been formally voted out of Wildflower LLC entirely. They invoked another clause I hadn't read carefully enough. Something about founder dilution after a, quote, no confidence determination, and my 35% ownership was reduced to a payout of $41,000, which they then withheld pending what Doug called a review of operational damages caused by prior management. Prior management was me. My landlord at our apartment in Selwood was a nice older guy named Mr. Chu, who I'd been renting from for 2 years. On December 15th, he called me up apologizing, almost crying himself, and said he'd been contacted by someone claiming to be from a property management company who had documentation showing I'd been running an illegal short-term rental out of the unit. He didn't believe it, but the paperwork looked official, and his daughter was a lawyer and had told him he needed to issue a notice to vacate to protect himself in case it was real. I had until the end of the year. I begged him. He apologized again. He said he was sorry maybe 4 times. That's where the 11 weeks ended. That's how I ended up in a Fred Meyer parking lot on December 19th with a sick child in the back seat and a text from my mother saying don't come around anymore. I drove to the emergency room at Adventist Health on Northeast Glizzen because it was the closest hospital and I'd been there once before when Posey split her chin on a coffee table. The triage nurse took one look at her and brought us straight back. They listened to her lungs. They said the word pneumonia. And then they said walking pneumonia. And then they said they wanted to do a chest x-ray and start her on IV antibiotics. The nurse was kind. She put a warmed blanket on Posey and told her she had a brave little face. Then a woman from admissions came in with a clipboard. I want to be clear about what happened, because I know how this part sounds, and because I've seen enough of these stories where someone says they got turned away from an American emergency room over money, and the comments fill up with people saying that's illegal. That's not how it works. They're right. It is illegal under federal law to refuse to stabilize a child in respiratory distress. That's not what happened. What happened was more bureaucratic and slower and in some ways worse. They stabilized her. They gave her 1 dose of IV antibiotics and oxygen by nasal cannula, and her fever came down 2 degrees over about 4 hours. Then around 3 in the morning, an attending physician came in and said the x-ray showed it was a moderate case, but she really needed a full course of inpatient IV antibiotics, probably 3 or 4 days. The hospital's financial counselor came in shortly after that. Very professional, very polite. She said she could see I'd let my insurance lapse in November, which had happened because the COBRA payments after losing the restaurant were $940 a month. And I didn't have $940 a month. She said the estimated cost for a 4-day pediatric admission was somewhere between $18,000 and $26,000. She said there was financial assistance, of course, but the application took 30 to 60 days to process, and in the meantime the hospital would pursue collections, and given that my child was now stable, I had the option of discharge against medical advice with a prescription regimen at home, or admitting her and committing to the financial obligation. I asked her, and I tried to keep my voice low because Posey was finally asleep. I asked her what she would do if it were her kid. She looked at the floor for a second. Then she said, off the record, that a lot of parents in my situation took the discharge and the oral antibiotics and watched their kid carefully at home. She said it usually worked out. She said usually. I signed the discharge papers at 4:15 in the morning. They gave me a prescription for amoxicillin and a steroid inhaler and a sheet of instructions that said to come back if her breathing got worse or her fever didn't drop in 24 hours. I carried Posey out through the automatic doors and the cold hit her like a slap and she started coughing again. That wet, rattling cough, and I stood there in the ambulance lane in the freezing rain, just holding her. I couldn't go back to the apartment. Mr. Jerusing. Chu had been kind, but the notice was real and I didn't want to spend the last days I had in that place. I drove. I went to a 24-hour Walgreens and filled the prescription with the last of my checking account, which left me with $7 and change. Then I drove out to the parking lot of a Lowe's near the Columbia River because the lot was big and quiet, and I'd read once that store security in Portland mostly left people alone if you parked at the edge. I reclined the driver's seat. I climbed into the back and pulled Posey onto my chest under my coat so my body heat would keep her warm and my arms could feel her breathing. She slept. I didn't. The thing nobody tells you about being 1 bad week away from this is how quickly your brain reorganizes itself. By the second night in the Subaru, I'd already memorized which gas station bathrooms didn't have a code on the door, which Starbucks would let you sit for 2 hours on 1 cup, which library branches opened earliest. Posey thought we were on a Christmas adventure. I told her we were doing something special this year. I gave her amoxicillin twice a day with a juice box from a food bank in St. John's and read to her from a paperback copy of The Boxcar Children that I grabbed from a little free library in a neighborhood I drove past on the second morning. She loved that book. She kept asking if the children in the book were us. I kept telling her, no, baby. We have a car. We're luckier than that. On the night of December 23rd, I had $11 left from the cash I'd gotten from selling my grandmother's gold chain at a pawn shop in Milwaukee. Posey's fever was creeping back up. Her breathing had started to get faster and shallower again, that quick little wet sound, and I knew I was going to have to take her back in, and I didn't know what I was going to do when they tried to discharge her again or admit her with a bill I couldn't pay. The sleet had turned to snow. Real snow, which Portland gets maybe twice a year, and it was coming down hard, the kind that sticks. I had parked in a corner of the lot of a closed garden center off Sandy Boulevard because I couldn't even bring myself to drive to the hospital yet. I was sitting in the driver's seat looking at my daughter in the rearview mirror, and I prayed for the first time in 8 years. I didn't even know what I was praying to. I just said, please, out loud. Please, please. That's when the headlights came up beside me. It was a black SUV, a Lexus, the big kind. It pulled into the space next to mine very slowly. I assumed it was somebody who'd gotten lost or somebody who was going to tell me I couldn't park there. Then the passenger window rolled down on the SUV and the driver leaned across the seat and I saw it was an older woman, maybe late 60s, with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She said, "Sarah? Sarah Coleman?" I had not given anyone my name. I had not told anyone where I was. I had been off social media for 2 weeks. My phone was on airplane mode to save battery. I rolled my window down maybe 2 inches. The snow blew in. I said yes very carefully, the way you do when you don't know if the person on the other side knows something useful or something dangerous. She said her name was Eleanor Vance. She said she'd been looking for me for almost a week, and she was sorry it had taken so long. She said she'd hired a private investigator on the 17th, and he'd finally tracked the Subaru that afternoon through a license plate reader at a gas station off 82nd. She said her assistant had a hotel room booked for me and Posey at the Heathman downtown, and a pediatrician on call, and could I please just follow her car, and she would explain everything once Posey was warm. I want to tell you that I asked smart questions. I want to tell you that I made her show ID, that I called the police, that I did any of the things a responsible person would do when a stranger in a Lexus rolls up in a snowstorm and offers a hotel room. I didn't. I asked her one question. I asked her how she knew my name. She said, "You probably don't remember. It was a long time ago. There was a fire at the Lloyd Center, in the old food court, in the spring of 2016. You were a teenager. You pulled a woman in a wheelchair out through the loading dock before the sprinklers came on. That was my mother." I remembered. Of course I remembered. I had been 19, working a hostess shift at a Mediterranean place in the mall food court the summer before my sophomore year at Portland State, and a grease fire in the kitchen at the place 2 doors down had jumped the suppression system. And there had been a woman in an electric wheelchair whose chair had stalled by the seating area while everyone else ran, and I had gotten behind her and pushed her out through the back. I had given my first name to a paramedic, and then I had gone home and thrown up from the smoke and never thought about it again, because she had been fine, and I had been fine, and that was the whole story. Eleanor said her mother had lived another 4 years after that. She said her mother had asked her every Christmas if she had found the girl who pushed her chair. Eleanor said she was sorry it had taken so long. I followed the Lexus through the snow into downtown Portland. Posey was awake in the back, watching the light smear across the wet windows. She asked me if we were going somewhere with a bed, and I said, "Yes, baby, we are." And I started crying in a quiet, ugly way I couldn't control. The room at the Heathman had 2 queen beds and a heated bathroom floor. There was a pediatrician already there when we got up to the room, an older man named Dr. Tobias, who Eleanor said had been her mother's primary care doctor for 30 years and now did concierge work in retirement. He examined Posey on the bed with a cartoon comforter and listened to her chest for a long time and asked me questions about the antibiotics and the timing of the fever spikes. Then he told me, very calmly, that she did need to be admitted, but he was going to admit her himself through a private pediatric service at Providence, and the billing would be handled outside the standard insurance pipeline, and I should not worry about it for tonight. He said worry was going to be very tempting, and I needed to ignore the temptation. I sat in the chair by the window of that hotel room while my daughter got the IV antibiotics she should have had 4 days ago, and I cried for about 40 minutes. And then Eleanor came in with a cardboard tray of soup from the room service kitchen and sat down across from me and told me what she actually wanted. She didn't want to pay me back, she said. That wasn't what this was. She said she had been quietly looking for me since her mother had died in 2020 and that she had a foundation, the Vance Family Foundation, that her mother had started decades earlier, and that she had run since she retired from a career as a federal prosecutor in the District of Oregon. The foundation had close to $40 million in assets. It funded food security work in pediatric medical access programs in the Pacific Northwest. Eleanor said she was 68. She had no children. Her sister had died of cancer the previous year, and she had been thinking very seriously about who she could trust to run the foundation after she stepped down. Then a board member had forwarded her a piece about a small Portland restaurant called Wildflower that had been quietly building a kitchen scholarship program for women coming out of recovery houses. That program had been mine. I'd started it the year after Caroline's first overdose. The article had had my photo. Eleanor had recognized the name. She'd started looking into me. She'd hired the private investigator about 10 days before she found me, after one of his early reports came back with what she described as a very strange pattern of business interference and what looked to her, with her former prosecutor's eye, like a coordinated campaign. She had spent the last week reading documents her investigator had pulled and feeling, she said, increasingly furious. She didn't say the next part right away. She let me eat the soup first. Then she said, very evenly, that she did not believe my stepfather had simply made bad investment decisions. She believed, based on what she'd seen, that there was a coordinated pattern of fraud involving Roger and Doug Hennessy and the man named Curtis Ackerman, and that pattern probably went back further than my restaurant, and probably involved other people he'd done business with. She said her investigator had already pulled some property records and some shell company filings that did not add up. She said if I was willing, she would like her foundation's legal team to look at all of it, at no cost to me, and that she would also like me to consider, when I was ready, taking a position at the foundation. Not a charity job, she said. A real one. Director of programs. She said she had watched me from a distance, in the documents and the photos and the way I had built something honest, in a city full of restaurants that pretended at honesty, and she thought I might be the right person. I told her I needed to sleep. She said of course. She left the soup. She left a business card on the dresser. She said the room was paid through the end of January. I slept for 14 hours. Posey was discharged from Providence on December 28th, fully recovered, eating French fries in the back of Eleanor's Lexus. I moved into a furnished apartment in the Pearl that the foundation kept for visiting fellows. I started, very quietly, working with Eleanor's attorney, a woman named Renata Salazar who had been a U.S. attorney in Seattle before going private. Renata was 45 and had the calmest voice of anyone I had ever met. She took my files. She took the contracts. She took the email chain with Doug Hennessy. She told me that what had been done to me looked, on a first pass, like at minimum civil fraud, and that she would like to talk to a forensic accountant before she said anything more specific. By the third week of January, the forensic accountant had found things. Curtis Ackerman, the third board member I'd never met, was a shell. The address listed for him was a UPS store in Vancouver, Washington. Doug Hennessy had been disbarred in California in 2009 for misappropriating client funds and had reinvented himself in Oregon. Roger's auto parts company sale had been smaller than my mother had said, and a portion of the cash that had supposedly funded his investment in Wildflower had come out of a line of credit Roger had pulled against a property he co-owned with two other men in eastern Washington that the accountant strongly suspected was being used as a tax shelter for some questionable trucking income. Most importantly, the operational distress clause in my Wildflower contract appeared in 3 other small business contracts Doug Hennessy had drafted in the previous 6 years, in 2 of which the businesses had ended up entirely in Roger's hands or in the hands of a holding company linked to him. He had done this before. I asked Renata if we had enough. She said she wanted more. She wanted to give them a chance to say something incriminating on a recording. The opportunity came in early February. My mother called me. She left a voicemail. She said she had heard from someone that I was, quote, doing well now, and that she thought it would be good for us to sit down and talk. Caroline missed me, she said. Christmas had been hard. She wondered if I could come to the house for coffee that Sunday. I called Renata. Renata smiled, which I'd never seen her do, and said, yes, you should absolutely go to that coffee, and you should wear this. I wore a small recording device, legal in Oregon as a one-party consent state, clipped inside the collar of a sweater Eleanor had bought me for Christmas. I drove to my mother's house in Beaverton, the same house I'd waited in the front hall of 2 months earlier. And this time, my mother opened the door before I'd reached the porch and hugged me with what I knew, in my body, was not real warmth. Roger was in the kitchen. Caroline wasn't there. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of small talk about the weather and Posey's school and my mother's book club, and then Roger sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a folder and said he thought we could put all the unpleasantness behind us. He said he'd been thinking about Wildflower and how he'd hate to see it go to outside buyers. He said if I was willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a release of claims, the family was prepared to offer me a quarterly distribution of $15,000 from the restaurant's profits, plus my old payout reinstated, in exchange for my silence about the, quote, transition. I asked him what I was supposed to be silent about, specifically. He waved his hand. Misunderstandings, he said. Strong personalities clashing, the kind of thing that happens in any family business. I asked him about Curtis Ackerman. His face changed. Just a flicker. My mother, in the chair beside him, asked what Curtis had to do with anything. I asked him about the distress clause in my contract and whether he had used the same clause in the deal he'd done with a man named Frank Lutz in 2020. Frank Lutz was one of the other small business owners Renata's accountant had flagged. Roger sat back. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he did the thing I will remember as the moment I stopped being his stepdaughter in any sense at all. He smiled. A small, contemptuous smile. He said, "Sarah, you were never going to be able to run that restaurant for more than another 2 years. I just sped up the timeline. You should be thanking me. I gave you 40 grand and a story to tell." He took a sip of his coffee. He said, "And the next time you want to come at me with conspiracy theories, ask yourself who your mother is going to believe." My mother didn't say anything. I asked one more question. I asked her, looking right at her, if she had known about any of it. About the supplier sabotage, about the inspection, about Mr. Chu getting the notice. I asked her if she had known when she sent me the text on December 19th that I was sleeping in a car with a sick child. She said, very quietly, "Roger handles the business things. I just trust him." I stood up. I told them I needed to use the bathroom. I went to the bathroom and I stood in front of the sink and I looked at myself in the mirror for about a minute. And then I came out and I told them I had to go pick up Posey from a playdate, and I left. Renata met me in a parking lot off Cedar Hills Boulevard. She listened to the recording in the front seat of her car with her eyes closed. When it was over, she opened her eyes and she said, "We have him." The civil suit was filed in early March. The criminal referrals followed in April, after the Oregon Department of Justice's Financial Fraud Unit and the IRS got involved. Roger and Doug Hennessy were both indicted in May on a list of charges that included wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. 3 other small business owners came forward after the initial filings became public. The total alleged scheme came out to just over $9 million over roughly 7 years. Doug Hennessy took a plea in early summer and got 6 years and full restitution. Roger took it to trial. He thought a jury would like him. The jury did not like him. He was convicted on 12 of 14 counts in late September and sentenced to 8 years and 4 months in federal custody, plus $3.1 million in restitution, of which my share came to $462,000 after the other claimants and the IRS took theirs. Wildflower was returned to me through the civil suit. I kept the original location. I sold the second one because I couldn't run 2 and be the kind of mother I wanted to be. I used some of the restitution to fully fund the Kitchen Scholarship Program, which now operates as a partnership between Wildflower and the Vance Family Foundation, and trains about 14 women a year coming out of recovery programs. I started as director of programs at the foundation in October, working 3 days a week. Eleanor and I sit on the funding committee together. She calls me on Sunday nights sometimes just to talk. She has become, in a way I don't have the language for yet, something like family. The good kind. The kind that calls when nothing is wrong, just to hear how your week was. My mother was not charged with anything. The investigators couldn't establish that she had direct knowledge of the fraud, which I have come to believe is technically accurate and morally meaningless. She has called me 4 times since Roger's sentencing. I haven't picked up. She left a voicemail in November saying she was sorry, that she had been a fool, that she missed Posey. I listened to it once. I deleted it. Maybe someday I will be in a place where I can have a conversation with her. I'm not there. I might not get there. That is allowed. Caroline reached out separately. She is sober, has been for almost a year now, working as a peer support specialist at a treatment center in Hillsborough. She wrote me a letter, an actual paper letter, in which she didn't ask for anything. She just said she was sorry she hadn't been there, that she had been too sick to see what was happening, and that she hoped someday I might let her meet her niece. I wrote her back. We're working on it. Slowly. She came to dinner at Wildflower last week and met Posey for the first time in 3 years. And Posey, who is now 7 and has lost her 2 front teeth and reads at a 4th grade level, looked at her very carefully and then said, "You have the same eyes as my mom." And Caroline cried, and I didn't. Because I think I'm done crying about that particular family for a while. Posey's bedroom in our new apartment in Northeast Portland has a window that looks out at a Japanese maple. She has a real bed with a real headboard and a quilt that Eleanor's housekeeper made for her. Sometimes at night, when I'm tucking her in, she asks me if I remember the Christmas adventure. I tell her I do. I will always tell her I do, because that's what we called it. And because the worst week of my life was also a week she spent curled up against my chest in a parked Subaru reading the Boxcar Children, and a child is allowed to remember whatever version of a story keeps her safe. What I want to say, if there's anything I want anyone listening to take from this, is that the people who hurt you sometimes wear the same face as the people who raised you. And the people who save you sometimes turn out to be someone you helped years ago and forgot about, because you helped them in a moment when helping was the only thing to do. And that is the kind of person you want to keep being, even when the world is telling you it doesn't pay. It does pay. It just pays late. It pays in snowstorms and Lexuses and old women who remember. And if you are somewhere right now, in a parked car, in a hotel room you can't afford, in a kitchen at 3 a.m. trying to figure out what to do with a sick child and an empty account and a phone that won't ring, I want you to know that I was there too. And the world did not actually end. It just narrowed for a while, and then it opened back up. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is. I'll be reading. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me how all of this happened, not the legal version, the real one. And I think the truest answer is that I let it happen by being the kind of daughter who kept hoping. Roger didn't outsmart me. He outweighted me. He counted on the fact that I would sign the paperwork without my own lawyer because my mother was crying on the phone, and he was right. That signature on page 19 wasn't bad luck. It was the first quiet domino I tipped over myself, and every domino after that was already lined up, because I refused to see who the people in front of me actually were. That's the part that's hardest to write. The fraud, the parking lots, the $18,000 hospital estimate, those all came from Roger, but the door he walked through I opened. Hope without judgment is just a key you hand to anyone who smiles at you the right way. I learned that the cold way. I'd rather learn it once than spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't. There's another piece to this, though, and I want to be careful with it. The night Eleanor pulled up next to my Subaru, I didn't earn that. Nobody earns being saved. But the reason she could find me at all was that 19-year-old version of me who pushed a stranger's wheelchair out of her burning food court and then went home and threw up and forgot about it. I didn't help that woman because I thought it would come back to me. I helped her because she was right there. And helping was the only thing a person could do. If there's a rule I believe in now, it's that the small decent things you do when no one is watching, when there's nothing in it for you, those are the only things that quietly stay alive in the world after you've stopped thinking about them. They're not a transaction. They're more like seeds you scatter without expecting a garden. Some die. Some take 11 years to come up. You don't get to know which. The other thing I learned is that endurance is not the same as virtue. I used to think being the strong one, the one who didn't complain, the one who held it all together for Posey, was what made me a good mother. It almost made me a dead one. The night I prayed in that garden center parking lot, I wasn't strong. I was finished. And being finished, all the way finished, was what finally let someone else in. There's a kind of pride that masquerades as resilience, and it will keep you alone in your car until you let it die. Posey is 7. She has lost her 2 front teeth. She does not know yet that her grandmother chose her stepfather over her. Someday she will, and I will tell her the whole story, and I will tell her the part I am telling you now, which is that the people who love you are the ones who show up when it costs them something. Everyone else is just family and name. That's a hard thing to teach a child. It's a harder thing to live.